Hey everyone, this is the tutorial for Renzo piano. So if we look at some of Renzo piano drawings, he does a lot of his stuff by hand. And for the sake of showing you how to model some of these things digitally and how we can start to hybridize hand making with digital drawing construction, I went ahead and we're going to go ahead and focus on this drawing, which I'm going to bring into Rhino by using a command that we'll get to in a couple of seconds. But all I did is basically looked up Renzo piano drawings on Google and did a save image as, and I saved it to my desktop. And the way that we can bring it in, I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer called picture. And if I make sure that layer is selected and I type in the command picture, what I'm going to be able to do is look at all the JPEGs and PNGs on my computer and bring any of them in. So just so I can have it as a reference, I'm going to go ahead and bring this drawing in like so. And now you can see that it's part of our workspace and I can actually use it to reference instead of flipping back and forth between Google and Rhino. So the first thing we want to do is actually make a copy of this. And I'm going to do that by selecting everything and simply typing in copy and hitting enter. And if I bring it over maybe like 20 feet and hit enter, you'll notice that it's going to lock it to that radius. If I hold down shift, it'll automatically lock it over to a side. If you weren't able to select this bottom point down here, you'll notice that there's a little thing that says end int not. Basically, you want to make sure that OSNAP is on down here and that all of these things that I have checked are checked. I usually have end, near, point, mid, intersection, perpendicular, quad, and not. So you'll notice that if I don't have, if I have my OSNAP turned off, I'm not able to select that point. But as soon as I turn it on, we are good to go. So now that I have a copy of this thing over here, I'm going to go ahead and lock this so that we have an original copy of our drawing in case we accidentally delete it or something over here. And the only thing that I'm really going to use for this tutorial is the surfaces rather. So I'm going to go ahead and hide those and delete everything else and then type in show to bring it back. So if yours are individual, you need to join them together by simply selecting everything and typing join. If it's already a poly surface, meaning that you can click it once and the whole thing is highlighted, you are good to go. But I want to make a couple of copies of this by making sure that my gumball is turned on down here. The gumball, of course, is this blue and green and red thing right here. If I turn it off, you'll notice that it goes away. If I hold down Alt while clicking and dragging with the gumball tool, it's actually going to make a copy of it for me. Alternatively, of course, we can do the same copy command and just make a couple of different copies for that. But all I'm going to need are 3 copies. And the next thing that I'm going to do is scale these ones on the outside. You'll notice that there's kind of smaller portions of Renzo piano's works off to the side, and then there's often like something in the center that's emphasized that's a much larger volume. So if I click on this one and type in scale and hit enter, again, I'm going to want to make sure that my OSNAPs are on down here. And basically, I'm just going to click on one corner of the object and the other corner, and then make it half the size. And I'm going to do the same process over here. And because we want this to read as like a single building, I'm going to go ahead and move these by typing in move, clicking on a corner, and bringing it over here. And I'm going to do the same thing for this guy. It's a little bit repetitive for my liking, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and click on one of them. And on the gumball tool, there's these blue lines. I'm going to change the color of my surfaces so you can see this better. There's a blue arc tool that'll actually allow you to specify what degree you want to rotate the object. So if I type in 180, that'll give me a nice break in the symmetricality of this thing. And I can also do what's called mirror. So if I click on this and type in mirror and hit enter, it's going to ask us for the start of the mirror plane. And I'm going to click on this side of my object and the other one, and you'll notice that it basically creates a copy of the thing. If I had a line right here, it's basically being flipped over to the other side. So I'm going to delete the original one and move it over yet again. And I think that gives a nice kind of asymmetricality to the project. So in order to make this look like a building or kind of the inner workings of a couch, I'm going to go ahead and do what's called shell. So if I click on an object and type in shell, it's going to ask us to remove a face. So if we look at this, obviously the front face is disappeared and it's actually cutting through a bunch of different floors and walls. So we're going to do the same thing over here. I'm simply going to click on this front face right here and right click. And it's going to tell us the shell result isn't solid. And I think because this is a pretty low intensity tutorial, that's probably perfectly fine. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for these other ones. If your shell thickness isn't what you would like it to be, I'm going to go ahead and edit, undo, or Control Z on the Mac. I believe that would be I think it would still be Control Z. But if I type in shell, you can notice that there's a thickness right here. So if I type in like 0.5, it's obviously going to be a smaller thickness than it was before. But I'm going to go ahead and keep mine at 1. Yours may be different depending on the units of your project and the scale of your couch, because it seems to have gotten wonky for a lot of you. So just play around with it and make sure that it's something that looks good to you. So I'm going to go ahead and do the shell command over here as well. And finally, I'm going to do it over here. The way I am going through these commands so fast is by right-clicking. If you right-click, it actually reruns the same command that you just ran. And that's how I've been speeding through this pretty quickly. You'll notice that we have a double wall situation happening right here. And you'll also notice that this got separated from this outer piece. So I'm going to go ahead and select those two and group them. And the same situation happened over here. And I'm actually going to move this so that this wall, quote unquote, is touching this corner so that they're actually overlapping. And I'm going to do that by typing in move, of course, and then clicking on this point and clicking on this point. And now instead of having two separate thicknesses, it's just one conjoined thing and it's consistent across the entire building. I'm going to do the same thing for this. Alternatively, since we know our thickness is 1, we can actually just type in move. Click on any point along this surface and type in 1 and hit enter, and then click on another point along the surface and you'll see that it is perfectly aligned. So the next thing we want to do to make it look more like a building is to create some floor plates. And I'm going to do that by creating a new layer over here and typing in floor plates. And we'll make them like a nice, or not nice, but an aggressive lime green, and make sure that that layer is active. So if I type in box, what that's going to let me do is basically click on a couple of corners and make a solid box. So if I click in this bottom corner right here, and then maybe go to the midpoint in the back of this, and then make it a 1 unit tall box, it's actually going to create a box. And I can start to click and drag that until it's in a good position and it looks nice. Again, I'm going to go ahead and copy this box down to the other side. And I actually want to make this one a little bit smaller, which you can adjust by simply clicking and dragging on the gumball tool. So we'll make something like this, a little bit thinner. We'll move it back over and adjust it up just a tad bit. So now it's starting to look a little bit more like a building. If you want, you can even make another copy of it and close off one of these rooms by simply moving it in line with this. And we can actually do a command called scale 1D. And what that's going to let us do is, instead of scaling it proportionally, it'll only scale it in one direction. So if I click on the bottom of the object and the top of the object, I can basically click on the bottom of this floor plate, and you'll see that this distance didn't change, but the vertical one did. And I think that'll get us a pretty interesting section cut. So what I'm going to do is make a new layer and name it Poche. I'm going to go ahead and make it red. You can make it whatever color you would like, and make sure that that layer is activated. And I'm going to go ahead and type in line. And I'm going to click on the bottom left and the bottom right of all 3 of these buildings. And I'm going to select that thing and type in extrude CRV. And what that's going to do is, of course, allow me to extrude that line in a single direction and make a plane. I'm going to go ahead and hit both sides equals yes. If that option doesn't show up, you can simply hit B and then enter. And basically I just want to make sure that the surface covers the entire object, or surfaces that we've made so far. Again, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that this is wider than this. So basically this project will be centered in the middle of this plane. And I'm going to move it back -1 inches. And the reason I'm going to do that is because if you imagine like taking a section cut, you can take it really anywhere through the building. But I'm just going to do it like a 1 unit back. And I'm actually going to go into our top view. And the way you get into top view is by typing in toolbar and making sure that this set view tab is checked wherever it's at, right here. And then you can go to your set view tab and ultimately click on the top view as such. So I'm going to go ahead and select everything except for our cutting plane and type in split. And select that cutting plane now. And what that's going to do is after I hit enter or right click, it's going to separate all of the stuff in the front from the stuff in the back. So you'll notice that this piece split, but this one doesn't look like it did. And the reason is because this is 2 different objects and they're grouped together. So what I'm actually going to do is highlight everything and type in ungroup. Be careful when you do this moving forward, because there might be some stuff that you actually have to keep grouped. And if that's the case, basically I just usually make a copy and then ungroup everything in that one single instance, just so I don't ungroup everything and have to meticulously go back through and readjust everything. So now I should be able to select everything on this side of the section cut. Beautiful, and I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And now I'm going to do the Intersect Two Sets command. So I'm going to select everything except for that cutting plane and type in Intersect Two Sets. And now I'm going to highlight our cutting plane and hit enter. And what you'll see is that it basically found all the instances this is intersecting with this and put it into some nice line work for us. So I'm just going to drag that off to the side and then use my gumball tool to make it flat so that when I go into my top view, it's actually facing us. You'll notice that some of this stuff got kind of wonky. And the way that we're going to fix that, we're going to go ahead, when we have all of this selected, we're going to type explode. And we're going to go ahead and type trim. And basically, we want to make sure that a section cut is basically an entire fill. So if I poured a bunch of sand in this corner, eventually the sand would work its way around. It would stop right here, but we actually want it to fill up the entire thing. So we're going to go ahead and trim this and this and this. As we can see, it's now one successive piece. So I'm going to go through very quickly and make sure that everything is trimmed nice and proper. And I think this is looking pretty good. So you can left click and drag to select a bunch of different lines. So if like you click on something and like a little menu that says curve, curve, curve pops up, I would just kind of click and drag over that line and call it a day. But once I hit escape, I'm going to go ahead and group those together. And now it's looking kind of flat. In Renzo Piano, he kind of shows the depth of the thing. So this would be somewhere in the background. Of course, this would be somewhere in the background. So we want to do that same thing by going to our view of all of our surfaces. I'm going to go ahead and delete this plane. And I'm going to select everything and go into our the same view of this, but non-perspectival. So that would be either the right view, and we can see that that's not the one that we want. We actually want the left view. Maybe we did want the right view. Kind of having trouble reading this. Okay, actually we do want the right view. Yours will probably be different depending on what side you took the section cut from or how your thing is modeled. So I'm going to go ahead and run make 2D. I want to make sure that scene silhouette is off and group output is also off and hit OK. It'll take a second to process. And I'm going to go back into my top view and basically bring it into the same vicinity as this guy right here. We can see that it gets a little bit wonky, and that's perfectly fine. I'm actually going to type in move, and because we know that this point is the same as this point, I'm just going to move it to that area. And when I unclick, basically they're going to be overlapping one another. So if I right click on my poche layer and select all of those objects, I'm going to hold down Shift and click all of the lines that show up in these main volumes. So like this would be the ceiling plane and kind of the back of the room. This would be the same condition. And this would actually be kind of the exterior, I guess, top of the ceiling in the background. So I'm going to select those lines as well. And now when I drag it upwards, it's basically going to leave all of the duplicate line work that we could just go ahead and delete. You'll notice that this does not touch this. So the way that we're going to fix that is by selecting this line and typing in extend. And now we can just click on this line. It'll find a way to kind of bring it back over to the side. And we're going to do the same thing. Actually, we don't need to do it anymore. We're also going to get rid of this little straggler right here because this obviously is going to be all filled in black by holding down trim and just clicking those two lines to get rid of those. So I think this is looking really good. The last thing that we'll notice in Rhino real quick is that he has a ground plane that extends off to the sides of the drawing. So we're going to go ahead and do that too. This part is going to be kind of dependent on the model, but I'm going to basically go to my bottom floor plate right here and type in maybe like 50 units. Yeah, that looks okay to me. And if you have Smart Track turned on, and the O-Snap turned on, you can basically hover over a corner for like a second and then it'll snap to that location. So the command that I just ran is Polyline. Polyline is different than line because you can click multiple times on it. So if I type in line and do this, the command is over. Whereas if I do Polyline, I can click multiple times and the fun never stops until you hit enter. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this over to the other side just so we have a consistent ground plane on both sides. And we're going to go ahead and move that into place. And you'll notice that our sand analogy no longer works because it would stop at this corner and make a right. So if I select all of that line work and type in trim, I can go ahead and get rid of that really quickly. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So now we should be able to bring this into Illustrator. I'm going to go ahead and type distance and see just how big this thing is. It looks like it's 172 inches. So if we assume that we're going to put this on like a 2-foot sheet of paper, we're going to go ahead and make the scale, I don't know, maybe 100 or 10 inches equals 1 inch, and that should give us about 17.25 inches in Illustrator. We just want to get it to like a rough size so that we can start to scale it once we get into Illustrator. None of these drawings really have a scale that we're requiring you to have. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this closer to the origin point, which is this guy right here. I'm going to File, Export Selected, and I'm going to go to save it as, let's see, an Illustrator file that's called Renzo Piano line work, or LW. And of course, this model scale is going to come up. I'm going to do 10:1. This is going to depend again on what your units are and how big this drawing is, but that should work just fine for me. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my Illustrator file and open up what we just produced, which is going to be right here. Takes a second to process. And you can see that our line work made its way into Illustrator. I'm going to go ahead and make my document like, I don't know, maybe 24 by 18, something like that. That actually might be a little bit tall. Let's do 24 by 12. And I think that gives a nice thinness to this whole drawing. If I go ahead and select all of this, there should be something that pops up at the top for the width and the height of this thing. I'm going to go ahead and constrain the width and height proportions and make this 24, because we know that our artboard is 24 inches wide. If we do edit, copy, and then actually delete this, I can hit Control-0, and that'll center the artboard on the page, and I can just do edit, paste, and that should fill up the exact length of this entire thing. So while we have all this line work selected, I'm going to go ahead and change the stroke color by double clicking on this question mark guy or the box on the right, and change the RGB value to 000 and hit OK. And now we can see all of our line work is nice and shows up. So if your workspace doesn't look like this, go to Window, Workspace, and Essentials Classic. I usually have Essentials Classic checked, except instead of libraries over here, I change it to links, which you can go to this same kind of area and hit links, and it'll pop up for you somewhere, and you can just drag it over to the side. But I'm going to go ahead and go to my Layers tab and select everything that's not the poche. And I'm going to go ahead and make it like maybe 0.5 inches, just so, because it's in the background, I want it to be a lighter line weight. And I'm going to go ahead and drag that to the bottom layer as well while I am at it. So I think that this is a pretty interesting tutorial because you're probably going to have to hand draw a lot of stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer called hand drawn images. And I'm actually going to go to File, Place, and bring in a couple of images that I drew very similar to this. So I'm going to go back into Illustrator and do File, Place, and place two images that I just kind of took from my notebook from a long time ago and just kind of sketched up quick. I sketched a couple of trees and people, which I'll point out in a second. Basically, if I just click those two into existence, you'll notice that I drew some trees and some arrows and some people and wrote down some stuff. I'm going to go ahead and crop those images down to a rough kind of size like this, something like that, something like this, something like that. And I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And I'm going to do the same thing for this image real quick. Basically what that's going to do for us is not confuse the computer about the lights and the darks of the image that we have. So we're going to do the same thing that we did in the first part of the tutorial, kind of the hand-drawn stuff, and hit image trace. There might be something that pops up that says, you know, the image may be too large, and you're just like, okay, whatever. And I'm going to do the same thing for this guy over here. And what I can do once the image trace happens is I can hit expand. I'll do the same thing on this one, and then right click it and ungroup it. And now I should be able to, sometimes it doesn't happen perfectly. And if it doesn't happen perfectly, you can just hit right click and ungroup it again. But the way that we know that it's working is if I just like click and drag one of these, there's going to be a transparent hole in the background. So if I select one of these and hit select same fill color, it's going to select all of the white on the page, and I can just delete that. I also want to delete kind of the notebook rings that I had over to the side. And now we have a layer called hand-drawn images. If there's a situation where, you know, moments like this where the lines start to actually break up, I'm going to just create a new layer and named it hand-drawn images supplemental. And I'm going to lock every layer except for that one, and basically go to my pen tool. And if you click on one point and then click on where it breaks, you can actually click and drag and basically adjust it to fit the curve. And it's going to pop up black, and that's okay. We can go ahead and go back to our selection tool and click off of it. And now when I click on it again, it'll actually allow us to swap and fill, swap the stroke and the fill, and we can just kind of play around with it until it looks about the right thickness. So I'm going to go ahead and do that really quickly for all of my images, and I'll fast forward through this part. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and unlock our hand-drawn images layer, and I'm going to go ahead and basically, I had to adjust some of the trees because if I tried to fill those in later down the line, because there was holes in some of them, it would fill in the entire thing and it wouldn't shade how we want it to shade. So I'm going to go ahead and select my individual stuff. So it would be the tree. Make sure that I get all of it. I can hit shift and click on stuff to deselect it. And I'm going to go ahead and do object, live paint, make, and that'll fix the problem. So you'll notice if I go to fill it in with the live paint bucket, it's now a solid shape and it's not bleeding through, as they say. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for the other trees that I just adjusted as well. So I'm going to fast forward again. Sweet. So now that that's done, we're gonna go ahead and start placing those in this render. A good way to do it is if like you wanna make sure that this all stays as one sentence, I can just highlight all of it and right click it and group it. And then that way, instead of dragging like kind of these individual components, I can drag the entire thing. So that's gonna be really important. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that real quick on my end. So I'm gonna fast forward an unprecedented third time. Sweet. So I think everything should be good to go. This is all a group. This is all a group, so on and so forth. Before we put these into this drawing, I actually want to, we should go through the poche again really quick. So our poche layer is locked. We're going to go ahead and lock everything except for that poche layer. And if I go ahead and select everything and do a object live paint make, we're actually able to flip it. And you can notice that all of it gets filled in. That's not exactly what we want. So instead of doing that, I'm going to go to the live paint bucket tool and flip the fill in the stroke. And I can actually just select this poche to fill out. So I'm going to make this one called poche 1, and I'm going to make a new layer called poche 2. Because as we talked about in the last video, there's kind of a transparency to what Renzo Piano does. You can see that he goes over some things twice with marker, and it kind of creates this layered opacity effect. So we're going to do a similar thing by going to this, going edit, copy, edit, paste in place, and bring that up to the poche 2 layer. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off poche 2 for now, so we can just focus on poche 1. What I think might actually be an okay idea is if we go to make this a kind of 1 point line thickness and go to Effect, Distort and Transform, Ruffin. And obviously this is kind of insane looking. I usually like to bring it down to something like this, maybe like 0.03. And that'll create kind of this wavy outline effect on the side of this. And we'll say like, these are just kind of settings you can play with. I'm gonna go ahead and say that something like maybe lucky 13 will be good, and it is. So you can just kind of play with these settings to get kind of a wavy thing that you like. And I'm gonna go ahead and hit OK. So you can see it's kind of like a scribbled hand-drawn effect. And I'm actually gonna do the same thing with the elevation lines, like these guys. If it'll select them, what layer are you on? It must be on that one. Yes, it is. So I'm gonna go ahead and select all of those. Effect, Distort and Transform, Ruffin. Go to Absolute, make it like 0.02 or 0.03, whatever, and make it like 13 per inch. And now there's kind of like a hand-drawn effect to that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and make this poche about 50% opacity. And then I'm going to turn on my poche 2 layer and do a very similar process. Go to Effect, Distort and Transform. Actually, I'm going to make this 1 point font as well. Effect, Distort and Transform, Ruffin, Absolute, 0.03 inches, and then lucky 13. You probably don't want these to be the same settings as the poche underneath. It is randomized. So if I do 0.02 and 12 per inch, it's actually going to change it a little bit. And I'm going to move it a little bit up and to the side just to kind of give it that marker effect. And we'll do this 50% opacity as well. So we can start to see there's some nice layers of transparency going on. If you don't like how light it is, you can go to like 75% opacity. And then do the same thing for the poche underneath. It's just kind of a matter of playing around with what you think looks good. And with that, I think we can start throwing some information into this thing from down here. So I'm going to go ahead and unlock everything except for, or I'm going to lock everything except for the hand-drawn images, which I guess it would be hand-drawn images. Oh, so I have them on 2 separate layers. That's probably gonna be fine. I'm gonna go ahead and basically just like grab this tree and place it in the background. And I'm gonna do the same thing for all of this stuff. So I'm gonna fast forward time number 4. All right, so I think this is looking pretty good, folks. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to start applying some of these colored pencil effects that Renzo Piano does in his stuff. And the way that I'm going to do that is pretty similar to what we did in the first tutorial that I uploaded, the one that kind of talks about hand drawing and stuff in Photoshop and Illustrator. And we know that we probably want to do it for the trees. We probably want to do it for like this to kind of show the shading, and we want to do it for the sun. So what I'm going to do is this is very important. So I'm going to show you in as much detail as possible what we are supposed to do. I'm going to select everything. I'm going to do Object, Live Paint, Make. This is probably going to pop up. We can just hit OK and hit Continue. And it's going to take a second to process. But what I want to do is do Edit, Copy, Edit, Undo, so that everything goes back to its original layer. And now I want to make a new layer and call it Photoshop Contrast. And if I hit Edit, Paste in Place, I can drag that live paint thing that we just did up here. So you'll notice that all of this, it's still on its original layers, but we also have a copy that's strictly all on one layer. So we know that we want to color in the trees. So we're going to go ahead and make that a nice bright green. We want to make sure this is filled and this is filled, this is filled, blah, 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 blah. Great. If you click and drag, you can actually basically select everything that you drag your mouse over, so you don't have to individually click everything. So that looks more or less awful, but that's okay. Oops. Okay, that's fine. We also want to fill in these trees over here. And we also want to fill in kind of these top ceiling areas inside of the building. Maybe even do it right here. And then, of course, we want to fill in the sun as well. We also want to make sure that stuff is being assigned different colors if it's touching something else. So, for example, we want to make sure that because these are so close to the tree, we probably want to change those colors. And because these two are overlapping, maybe we actually want to do something more like this. I want to make sure that my fill color is black on this, just so that we're only shading in kind of this portion. And from there, we're basically going to just click on our selection and turn the lines off altogether. And go back to our live paint bucket and make sure our fill is transparent, and just basically spam click on every color that isn't one of the ones that we just did. And you notice that all of that starts to disappear. So now what I'm going to do is go to File, Export, Export As, and we'll name it Renzo Piano Photoshop Underlay. Hit OK. And now when we open it up in Photoshop, we can do the same thing that we did in the last tutorial once I find it. And basically just use the magic wand tool to select a bunch of stuff that's the same color, make a new layer, and use our newly installed brushes to start to fill in some of this information. So I'm going to go ahead and fast forward through this portion. Again, if you need some more detail on this stuff, go back to the last tutorial, and I believe it is the first and second section of that. So once we have all of our colored pencil stuff done, we're going to go ahead and go to File, Save As, PNG, and we'll call it Renzo Piano Illustrator Underlay. We'll go ahead and save that. And now we'll go back to our Illustrator file and put that on a new layer. And we're going to call that Render underlay, which I already had because I imported the sun from the previous tutorial. So if I go ahead and show everything in my file and select that render underlay, I'm going to go ahead and drag that off to a different layer. Great. And now our render underlay layer should be blank, and it is. I think I can get rid of this green and red stuff because it looks really upsetting and I don't like it. So that was Photoshop contrast. We'll go ahead and just delete that layer. So if I have my render underlay layer activated, I'm going to go ahead and hit File, Place, and we're going to place that image that we just had. Please take the time to actually line this up really well. This is a final drawing, and we expect you guys to put in a good amount of time on this stuff. So basically, I'm just going to make sure that this is in the proper place. It should be the same scale because we exported it directly from Photoshop. And if we look at this, I'm not too big of a fan of how dense some of this colored pencil is. So what I can actually do is go back into Photoshop, and if I open up that PNG, the Illustrator underlay, I can go to my eraser, and you can actually make the eraser a colored pencil brush as well. So if I go down to my colored pencil set here and have it basically hover over, let's say like this, I can click on it a couple times and it'll get rid of some of that colored pencil markings that we've had before. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for these guys. I'll just do it real quickly. I don't need to fast forward through this part. But basically, I just want to lighten it up and make sure that it's not like the most overwhelming thing in the drawing. And certainly this is something that you can kind of decide on your own whether or not you want to do. It's really kind of the most free part of the semester where we just ask you guys to kind of do your own thing. But once it's looking a lot lighter like this, I'm going to go ahead and save it by hitting Control S or File Save. Once I go back into Illustrator, it's actually going to ask me if I would like to update the modified links. We're going to go ahead and hit yes, and this looks a lot better than it did before. So if I look back at this Renzo piano drawing, we can start to kind of do these whatever shapes in the background. So let's say I want to add like some kind of spiral. We can go ahead and use, I forget where it's at actually. It's underneath the line segment tool and make a spiral tool. We'll do something like that. And then we'll make it, I don't know, a nice red color, and make sure it's on the back layer, which it is. Maybe make it like 1-point font instead of 2-point font, so it's not as aggressive. And I think, you can start to look really closely at what he's doing with some of these drawings and imitating them. But this should get you a pretty good start on how to make something look like some Renzo piano work. I actually really do not care for this too much, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Some of the hand-drawn elements, of course, are missing from this. Like this one was definitely done by hand and this one was definitely done in the computer. But if you kind of print this stuff out and actually hand draw stuff, scan it back to the computer and use that live paint and image trace components that we used before, I think that you can start to understand and layer up a lot of this stuff. So with that, I think I'm going to call this tutorial good, and we'll check in with your progress next week and we can see what we can do to make everything a little bit better as we go on.